Guys, look. Hear me out. I feel that Red Bull is about to kick Checo to the curb, and all of this came from Daniel Ricciardo, of all people. Now, okay, of course, let's just make one thing absolutely clear. I want Checo to stay at Red Bull for as long as he wants to. I want him to get over his current rough patch, because at the moment, he's absolutely flummoxed as to what is going on with his car. He cannot explain the fact that 4 times this season, half of the races, he's not been able to qualify in Q3. But I'm seeing a lot of signs from the Red Bull garage that are making me worry a lot, and that we might be seeing Daniel Ricciardo a lot earlier than we expected, and it's all to do with the vicious Red Bull recycling policy. On ESPN, after Daniel Ricciardo did his watch-along for the Canadian Grand Prix, he was actually talking about wanting to end his career with the Red Bull racing team, saying that if he got a chance to drive the car in anger in proper race conditions, it would be a fairy tale ending to his career, starting off in a Red Bull team and then ending in a Red Bull team. Conveniently forgetting for the fact that he didn't technically start at Toro Rosso, he actually started in HRT, remember all of that? It kind of makes sense why he wants to come back to Red Bull. Whenever he's been at the track and whenever the F1 cameras are on him, everybody cheers. And that would make anybody feel better. If any time your mug is on the big screen, everybody cheers for you, you're like, really? Wow. But any immediate change to the roster at Red Bull Racing is really not going to be happening because Verstappen and Perez, they are currently locked into contracts. Or are they? Like I said, Perez has struggled to get into Q3 for the 4th time this year, and it's really not looking good. But to be fair, Canada's one of his bogey tracks, so he doesn't really perform that well here anyway. In fact, him finishing 6th is kind of in the average space of where he usually finishes in Montreal. But already that's actually proving to be a lesser statistic for another recent rear gunner. Valtteri Bottas had managed to actually get 100 Grand Prix in a row of actually being in Q3. So he was always qualifying in the top 10. Maybe sometimes Valtteri could fade away in the race, but ultimately he at least started relatively close to Lewis. But Checo's not really had that stability, especially these days. And I think it's safe to say that the Red Bull seat is pretty much the least stable on the grid, at least in terms of the higher up teams. But Christian Horner's trying to put on a brave face and just saying, look, Checo, don't worry about the title. That's just going to cause you undue stress. Just step back, try and refocus, regroup, try and get your groove back, and then go from there. So he's trying to be very supportive in front of the cameras to show that he's got Checo's back. But it seems like, according to Horner, Checo's just ignoring his advice, putting a lot of pressure on himself for utterly no reason. I think the reason why I'm starting to have my doubts is due to the fact of the Red Bull headspace. It's not a very healthy environment for your health up here. The pressure cooker environment of Red Bull's really starting to chip away at Checo at this point in his 3rd season at Red Bull. It's eroding his fortitude and leading to some very uncharacteristic errors, and not even his tyre whisperer abilities are enough to get him nearly past the Ferraris or anything like that. He just had to settle for a 6th place, but again, Canada's not one of his best tracks. But could all of this be the excuse that Red Bull needs to get rid of Checo? Horner can just say, well, we tried our best to try and get him back into his groove and we were looking out for him, but he wasn't really listening to team advice and just going it alone. And as far as we're concerned, we're a top team and we need both drivers to be on board and listening to our instructions, but we can't really do much with Checo. He's just doing his own thing. And that's not conducive to multiple constructors titles. How can we work with a driver that won't listen repeatedly to our advice? But ultimately, it's meant to actually herald the way for Daniel Ricciardo to come back in 2024. I know, breaking his contract, but as we saw at McLaren, contracts can be broken, sometimes to the tune of $18 million not to drive a car. Ferrari in 2010 broke Kimi Raikkonen's contract to not race, and he went off to do some rallying and got a lot of money out of it. And if Checo got a similarly big payout in terms of severance, I think that Red Bull could stomach it because they would get their ideal driver lineup again from 2016 to 2018. Ricciardo and Verstappen back together once more. But why would they hire Daniel instead of keeping Checo around to the end of his contract? Well, it's due to the fact that it's unfinished business, that's what. In recent times, Daniel Ricciardo is the only Red Bull driver to have not been fired from his tenure at the team. He's not been dropped or switched out or anything like that. No. He quit on his own terms to go and join Renault. He started a new challenge at Renault and some long-term goals, believing in the Renault project, and offered a lot of money in return. Horner said many times that Daniel leaving was an utter shame and that it was a real blow to the confidence of Red Bull, and that ultimately led to bringing up Gasly early, to having Albon then in instead, and then having to bring in Checo. There was a lot of instability in that second Red Bull seat I don't think would have been if Daniel Ricciardo just stayed put. Red Bull always wanted Daniel Ricciardo back, and when he came back in 2023, they made a big song and dance about it, and really reveling in the anti-McLaren sentiment. All of the Ricciardo fans throwing away their papaya stuff and then getting back into Red Bull gear once more. They're effectively embracing their old friend, like they're doing with Sebastian Vettel right now, him doing promotional stuff for the Nürburgring later this year. No matter what Sergio Perez does, in the eyes of Helmut Marko, he is not a Red Bull driver. He is not cut from the same cloth like Liam Lawson, Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon. Perez was not part of the Red Bull Junior program. He was not part of the mission statement of getting young drivers that were backed by Red Bull for many years onto the F1 grid, therefore showcasing that they can pick talent from a very young age and ride them to the top. Max Verstappen being their best example by miles. Sergio Perez was ultimately a convenience, a PR stunt as it were, because in 2020, when Racing Point just dumped Perez for no utter reason, even though he did better than Lance Stroll that year, to then bring in Sebastian Vettel for the transformation into Aston Martin, after many years of loyal service for that team, and ironically, that team actually rescued Perez from McLaren dumping him, which is really, really tragic. After Checo's first win at Sakhir, obviously Red Bull thought, we were planning on getting rid of Albon anyway, so instead of taking a punt with Tsunoda, why don't we just put in Checo and get a lot of hype? Everybody loved the fact that Red Bull had taken in Perez at the last minute, given him a deal at Abu Dhabi, and therefore kept his career going for at least a few more years, because it would have ended way too soon. Give him a top tier car, show the Tire Whisperer what he can do in a really, really strong car. Red Bull just got a lot of fans from that, especially in the Mexican market. Checo in 2021 was eternally grateful for having a really strong car that can go for victories, and he proved his loyalty by doing absolutely fantastic work in getting Max Verstappen his first title, and really getting Red Bull quite close to the constructors as well. I will never forget Abu Dhabi. Perez's tenacity to actually hold up Hamilton was incredible. No problems there, no worries there at all. He'll let Max do his thing and do his best for the team. But in 2022, now we're actually starting to see some fireworks from Checo, and at the start of 2023, we saw even more of that. Checo was starting to get a little bit punchy. He thought that he could actually go for wins and maybe even challenge Max Verstappen, because the RB18 and 19 were not so obviously tailored to Max Verstappen's driving style. Of course, he is a really, really gifted driver and can adapt, but the gap between them was not as big. It felt like maybe Checo's challenge for the championship might be legit, like we saw with Bottas at the beginning of every season, but it ultimately faded away. And we saw some friction between the drivers as well, with all of that chicanery at Monaco and then in Interlagos, and it was really starting to get a little bit hairy. So I get the feeling that Red Bull was starting to think, oh dear, they're actually starting to get very, very punchy with one another. And then the start of this season happened, we started to see more of it, more people talking about a flashpoint between those drivers, which could easily happen, but now it's somehow just been diffused. The fact that Red Bull is now the top car by miles. They have a constructors, Max has 2 titles. As far as Red Bull are concerned, Checo has served his purpose. Daniel Ricciardo is in the wings. I feel like the writing's on the wall for Checo because he's no longer the media darling. Red Bull does not like being hated amongst the F1 fandom. So, in a fit of peak perhaps in 2024, as I predicted in my F1 2024 prediction video, Daniel Ricciardo will replace Checo for the fact that he is more marketable. So he can finish where he started and end his career with the team that gave him his big break in Formula 1 in the first place. He will be very compliant, he will not rub Max up the wrong way, Max adores him as a friend and a teammate, he can spend a couple of years in Formula 1 before the big rule change in 2026, and therefore, there's not really much lost. Red Bull's already got a lot of development underway. There's not really going to be many rule changes before the next big one in a few years, so yeah, let Daniel have his fun. The fabled Red Bull curse, I think, is starting to return, having been absent for the last couple of seasons due to the fact that Checo drove the guts out of that car and was doing everything that Red Bull wanted him to do. and not to mention the fact that it was a popular decision and the Mexican fans absolutely loved it. But the Australian fans and the Daniel Ricciardo fans, they're even bigger. Often, when Red Bull sees that a driver is no longer pulling their weight and is not really doing as well as they should do, they really tend to sort of put a lot of pressure on them, and somehow they make more mistakes, and then they have no choice but to get rid of them. I know that Perez is a much more experienced driver than the likes of Gasly and Albon, but that also means there are a lot more expectations put on them than the likes of those rookies. And therefore, I think that it's just going to be even tougher for Perez to survive this, unless he can somehow now start challenging Max Verstappen consistently, getting some wins ahead of Max, and really solidifying the Constructors' title way earlier than expected. The same thing's happening with De Vries, because ultimately, De Vries was a publicity stunt for AlphaTauri. He did such a stellar job for Williams at Monza last year that to not sign him would be a fool's errand. Everybody liked the fact that De Vries was getting his chance finally to be in Formula 1 after many years of being in other categories, but now that luster has faded away. AlphaTauri is dead last in the Constructors, and no one really cares about Monza anymore. Even De Vries is saying that that's a distant memory and it should not really be factored in. And therefore, De Vries is no longer useful. He is no longer popular. Everyone is deriding him. And he's also not a Red Bull driver from their program, so out you go. Max is the only safe driver at Red Bull, honestly, and Daniel Ricciardo is too, because he was never fired. Comment below.